The lobby of Holston and Royce Consulting looked like any other corporate office. Polished marble floors, the hum of fluorescent lights, and employees rushing by, glued to their phones. But then, Terrence Dri walked in. No flashy suit, no entourage, just a man with a worn briefcase and a quiet confidence. The receptionist, Megan, barely looked up before dismissing him. Little did she know, the man she turned away would soon bring her entire company to its knees. Want to know what happened next? Subscribe now and don't miss this jaw-dropping story. Terrence Dri stepped into the marble-tiled lobby, his boots clicking against the polished floors. The sound was the only thing that pierced the hum of fluorescent lights and the low buzz of office chatter. He didn't look like the CEO of VAO, one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the region. In fact, he looked almost ordinary. His dark navy trench coat wasn't designer, just functional. The leather briefcase he carried had clearly seen better days, worn at the edges, but it was still a symbol of his journey, of everything he had built with his own hands. As he made his way toward the front desk, no one seemed to notice. A couple of employees barely glanced up from their phones, lost in their own world of emails and messages. Terrence didn't mind. He was used to being overlooked. He had learned early on that the world would often judge him by his appearance, by the color of his skin, the simplicity of his clothes, or the lack of a bodyguard at his side. But that was fine. He didn't need anyone to notice him. He wasn't here for their attention, he was here for something far more important. Megan, the receptionist, was scrolling through her phone when he arrived. She didn't even look up. The faint scent of fresh espresso lingered in the air, but it didn't seem to matter to her. She was busy, more interested in the latest text than in the man who had just walked in. Terrence stood for a moment, waiting for her to acknowledge him, but she didn't. Her eyes flicked briefly to the clock behind him, then back to her phone. Finally, with a casual tone, she looked up, barely meeting his eyes. "What department are you here for?" she asked, her voice flat and uninterested. Terrence's pulse quickened. It wasn't the first time he had been dismissed. He had faced it before, at banks, at hotels, and even at conferences. People often assumed he wasn't who he said he was. But this time, something about the way she spoke struck him differently. It was more than a casual brush-off. It was an arrogance that cut deep, as if his presence didn't even matter. "I'm here for a meeting with the executive board," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "My name is Terrence Dri." Megan's eyes flicked to the clock again, and then down to her screen. She didn't look impressed. "I don't see you here," she said with a flick of her wrist, dismissing him as if he were just another contractor, a mere vendor. "Maybe you have the wrong building." Terrence stood still for a moment, not sure whether to laugh or be furious. The words hung in the air, thick with irony. The man who had turned a small logistics startup into a multi-million-dollar enterprise was now being dismissed by a receptionist, as though he were just another person who didn't belong. But Terrence didn't let his anger show. He had learned long ago that anger could cloud your judgment, and it wasn't worth wasting energy on people who didn't see your worth. He took a slow breath. "This is 1224 Wabash Avenue, correct?" he asked, his tone steady. Megan didn't even flinch. "Yeah," she said, rolling her eyes. "But like I said, we don't let vendors wait around up here. If you're just dropping something off, use the loading dock in the back." Terrence didn't argue. There was no point. Instead, he gave her the smallest of nods, his face neutral. As he turned to leave, he heard a voice behind him. A young associate, probably fresh out of college, stepped off the elevator and froze when he saw him. "Mr. Dri," the associate exclaimed, his voice full of surprise. "Wait, sir, you're early. They're still in the meeting." Terrence raised a hand, cutting him off. "No worries," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "Tell them thank you for the opportunity." With that, he stepped out of the building, the door closing softly behind him. He didn't look back. Outside, the rain was light, misting against his coat. It felt almost poetic, as if the weather itself was acknowledging the storm that had just brewed in his chest. As he walked away from the building, Terrence's mind raced. His gut told him that something was wrong, something he hadn't expected. This wasn't just a small oversight. This wasn't just a dismissive receptionist. It was a reflection of something bigger, something ingrained in the system. Holston and Royce had just made the worst mistake of their lives. They had no idea who they had just turned away. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number, Travis, a longtime associate at a rival company, Archon Systems. It was a risky move, but Terrence was past caring about risks. It was time to show them exactly what it meant to underestimate him. The phone rang twice before Travis answered. "Terrence," Travis said, sounding surprised. "You don't usually call unless something's gone wrong." "Something has," Terrence replied, his voice calm, but his words slicing through the air with the weight of finality. "You're about to get a deal worth $42 million, if you're ready for it." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "You serious?" Travis asked, incredulity dripping from his voice. Terrence didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. "Yeah," Terrence said finally, his words a quiet challenge. "It's all yours if you're ready." He ended the call and looked up at the skyline, the weight of the decision settling over him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He was just done. Done with people like Megan. Done with the arrogance of those who thought they could judge him without ever understanding who he was. And now, they would feel the cost of that mistake. It was time to let them watch as everything they had worked for crumbled. As Terrence Dri walked away from Holston and Royce, the mist from the rain clung to his coat, blurring the sharp lines of the city around him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. But across town, in a small coffee shop just off Wabash Avenue, another person was reflecting on the events of the day, someone who had no idea how deeply his actions would ripple through the lives of those around him. Simone Barkley, a senior partner at Holston and Royce, was sitting at a small corner table with her coffee untouched. She wasn't thinking about her work or her next meeting. She was replaying the moment over and over in her head. The moment when Terrence Dri had walked in, standing before the front desk like just another person, another nobody. But he wasn't. He was everything. Simone had known men like him before, men who didn't fit the mold, who didn't wear designer suits or have flashy resumes, but who had something deeper, something unspoken. She had seen the way he carried himself, the calm confidence in his eyes. He wasn't like the others. There was power in his silence, a quiet strength that unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. And when Megan had dismissed him without a second thought, Simone had felt a twinge of discomfort deep in her chest, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Simone was no stranger to power. She had earned her place at Holston and Royce, clawing her way to the top. She had spent years building her career, navigating boardrooms filled with men who saw her as a threat rather than an equal. She knew how to play the game, how to wear the right clothes, how to say the right words. But in that moment, watching Terrence Dri walk out of the building, she realized something she had never considered before. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. As Simone sat at the coffee shop, she found herself staring at her reflection, in the dark window, lost in thought. The sound of the coffee shop's chatter and clinking cups seemed distant, muffled. She thought about the other meetings she had been in that day, the other decisions she had made. The ones that had felt safe, comfortable, and predictable. And then there was Terrence. She hadn't seen him as a threat, at least not consciously. But something inside her told her that this wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was a lesson. Simone's mind wandered to her past. Growing up in a small town, watching her mother fight for respect in a male-dominated world, struggling to get the same recognition for her accomplishments that her male colleagues received without question. Simone knew what it felt like to be underestimated, to be seen as less than you were. And maybe that's why, when Terrence walked into the room and was dismissed so casually, it hit her so deeply. It was a reminder of everything she had fought for and everything he had already conquered. But even as the weight of the moment pressed down on her, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. She had watched the boardroom transform from a place of comfort to one of chaos in just a matter of hours. Megan, the receptionist, was still sitting at her desk, unaware of the storm she had just unleashed. But Simone knew. She knew that Holston and Royce had just made the most catastrophic mistake of their careers. It wasn't just about the deal, she realized. It wasn't just about the millions they had lost. It was about something deeper, more ingrained in the fabric of the company. The arrogance, the assumption that success could only look one way, the failure to see value in people who didn't fit the mold. And the worst part? They hadn't even realized what they had done until it was too late. Simone's phone buzzed, snapping her out of her reverie. It was a message from one of the junior partners. "Where's Terrence? Have you heard anything from him?" The words felt like a punch to her gut. The desperation in the message was palpable. They were already scrambling. She tapped a quick response. "It's too late. He's gone." And for a moment, she let the weight of those words sink in. As she sent the message, Simone felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief because she knew Terrence had made the right decision. He had walked away, not out of anger or revenge, but because he knew his worth. And guilt because, despite all her experience and success, she had underestimated him too. She had been a part of the system that had judged him, dismissed him, and failed to recognize his true power. Simone leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She knew the consequences of this mistake would be far-reaching. Holston and Royce was already feeling the sting. Clients were pulling back, investors were growing nervous, and the stock price was beginning its downward spiral. But it was more than just financial loss. This was about reputation, about respect. And Terrence Dri had taken both with him when he walked out of that building. For a brief moment, Simone allowed herself to imagine what could have been. What if they had treated him differently? What if they had taken the time to truly understand who he was and what he represented? But the reality was that they hadn't. And now, it was too late to change anything. As the coffee shop buzzed around, Simone looked out the window, her reflection now a shadow in the glass. She had been a part of something that had failed, not because of a lack of resources or talent, but because of a lack of respect, and it was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her career. The door opened, and a new customer walked, disrupting her thoughts, but Simone barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, on the man who had walked away, taking with him everything Holston and Royce thought they could never lose. The ripple effect. Turning point, Simone Barkley's mind continued to churn as she sat at the coffee shop, the hum of conversation around her fading into the background. What had just happened was still too fresh, too unexpected to comprehend. Terrence Dri had walked out of a deal worth $42 million because of a simple, casual mistake by someone who didn't even know who he was. Simone closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the situation wash over her. She had made it to the top, not just through hard work, but through knowing how to play the game. She had learned to navigate the power dynamics, how to read the room, how to make decisions quickly and decisively. But none of those skills had prepared her for this. None of them had prepared her for Terrence Dri, a man who was completely unfazed by the arrogance of the system, a man who refused to bend. Her phone buzzed again, dragging her back to reality. It was another message from the junior partner. "In the office, Mark Keller. We need to find him now. This isn't just about the deal. It's about our reputation. Everyone's waiting for an answer." What do we do? Simone's fingers hovered over the phone, her thoughts a whirlwind of panic. What could she say? There was nothing to be done. The Holston and Royce ship had already hit the iceberg, and it was sinking fast. The young associate, the receptionist, the entire front office had no idea what they had just unleashed. Her mind drifted back to the moment when Megan, the receptionist, had dismissed Terrence. She had seen it happen before, when someone in power dismissed someone they didn't think belonged. But in that moment, when she saw Terrence's calm composure and quiet confidence, something inside Simone had shifted. She had sensed that this wasn't going to be an ordinary setback. This wasn't just a small mistake that could be swept under the rug. Terrence was a man who didn't need to fight for recognition. He commanded it without uttering a word. And that was precisely why Holston and Royce would be paying the price. The realization hit Simone like a ton of bricks. Respect. That was what was lost here. Respect for someone who had built something monumental, despite the odds, despite the system. And now that respect was gone. Simone felt her phone buzzing again, but this time it wasn't a message. It was a call. It was Mark Keller. "Simone." Mark's voice cracked over the line. "We need to talk. The board's getting restless. There's talk of canceling the partnership. If we don't hear from Terrence soon, this could spiral out of control. We can't afford to lose this deal, do you understand?" Simone took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had been in worse situations before: emergencies, client crises, team disputes. But this felt different. It felt like a personal failure, not just a professional one. "Mark," she said, her voice controlled but heavy with frustration, "the deal is gone. There's nothing more to be done. Terrence has moved on, and I'm not sure he'll even pick up the phone if we call him again." There was a long silence on the other end. Simone could almost hear Mark's disbelief. "Are you saying we just let it go?" Mark asked, his voice cracking with the weight of the words. "After all that work, all those months, after everything?" Simone closed her eyes, letting the frustration build up inside her before releasing it with a slow exhale. She could hear Mark's breath on the other end, a mix of disbelief and panic, and it only made her feel more resolute in her decision. "Yes, Mark," she said finally. "We let it go." The words were hard to say, harder to accept, but Simone knew what the right thing to do was. Respect. It wasn't just about salvaging a deal. It was about acknowledging that some mistakes were irreversible. And Megan's arrogance had just cost them everything. Part 4. The Fall of the Tower. Unraveling the next morning, Simone sat at her desk, staring at the glowing screen in front of her. The numbers were all wrong. The projections were off. The emails kept coming. And the phone rang incessantly, but nothing felt real anymore. Holston and Royce had always prided itself on its sharp image, its reputation for excellence. But now, with the collapse of the Terrence Dri deal, the cracks in the foundation were becoming all too visible. Down the hall, Megan, the receptionist, who had sparked this disaster, was still at her desk, oblivious to the storm brewing. She hummed softly to herself, sipping on her iced coffee, scrolling through social media, unaware that her careless dismissal of a key player had set in motion a chain of events that would destroy everything. Simone stood up and walked to Megan's desk, the tension in her body palpable. She was angry, but it wasn't just the anger that kept her from speaking immediately. It was the deep disappointment. Megan had been a part of something larger, something meaningful, and now she had thrown it all away with a flick of her wrist. "Megan," Simone began, her voice colder than she intended. "Do you know what you've done?" Megan glanced up lazily, her eyes widening as she realized Simone wasn't smiling. What do you mean?" Megan asked, confusion clouding her face. Simone clenched her jaw, her thoughts spinning. She had the impulse to shout, to reprimand, to tear Megan down. But that wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't change the outcome. It wouldn't reverse the damage that had been done. "You've just ruined everything," Simone replied quietly, her voice tight. "That man you dismissed yesterday, he was worth more than this company could ever hope to make in a year. He walked away, and we can't get him back. Do you understand that?" Megan looked stunned, her lips parting in disbelief. "Wait, what, that guy was important?" Simone shook her head, her frustration boiling over. She wasn't sure if she was more frustrated with Megan's ignorance or with herself for not intervening sooner. "Yes, Megan," she said sharply. "He was important. He had the power to take this company to the next level, and you treated him like a nobody. I hope you realize what that means." Part 5. The Reckoning, Consequences. By the end of the day, the board had received the news. D-Tech Solutions had signed with Archon Systems. The shockwave that hit Holston and Royce was immediate and powerful. The stock price began to drop, clients started pulling out, and the investors began to whisper about the company's future. Simone could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, suffocating her every time she breathed. In a final meeting with the board, the heads of departments argued over who was to blame. Some blamed Simone for not stopping Megan. Others pointed fingers at Megan herself for not following procedures. The arguments were hollow, meaningless. The truth was undeniable. Holston and Royce had lost something far more valuable than money. They had lost their chance to be part of something bigger. Simone looked around the table at her colleagues. Most of them were silent, their faces pale and drawn. The arrogance that had once been their strength now lay broken, scattered across the room like shattered glass, and in that silence the weight of the lesson became crystal clear. Respect, once lost, could never be regained. The final word, a quiet victory. It was 2 months later when the phone call came. Simone sat in her office staring out at the skyline of Minneapolis, the city she had fought so hard to conquer. Everything had changed since that fateful day when Terrence Dri had walked away from Holston and Royce. The deal with Archon Systems had been finalized, and it had catapulted them to a level of success that Holston and Royce could never reach. The company had been in a constant state of panic since the loss, trying to salvage what they could. Contracts had been pulled, clients had left, and investors were getting jittery. The boardroom meetings were tense, filled with whispered accusations and half-hearted attempts to fix the damage. But it was too late. The respect, once lost, was gone. Simone's reflection in the glass window felt distant. She had spent years working her way up the corporate ladder, only to realize that what truly mattered wasn't the title, the power, or the prestige. It was the respect that came with integrity, humility, and understanding. Terrence Dri had shown her that in a way she could never have anticipated. She thought back to the moment when he had stood in the lobby, calm and composed, waiting for recognition that never came. When Megan had dismissed him, Simone had felt a shift deep inside her. She hadn't realized it then, but that was the turning point. Terrence had already won. His quiet confidence, his unshakable belief in himself, had been the true measure of his strength. He didn't need to fight for a place at the table. He simply walked away, knowing his worth, and by doing so he had stolen the one thing Holston and Royce could never reclaim: respect. But what haunted Simone the most wasn't the collapse of the deal. It wasn't even the financial losses, though. They stung. It was the realization that her company, which prided itself on its elite image, had been blinded by its own arrogance. They had dismissed Terrence Dri because he didn't fit their mold. And in doing so, they had dismissed something far more valuable: the power of quiet dignity, the power of someone who had built their success not on luck or privilege, but on character. Simone's phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Travis from Archon Systems. She hesitated for a moment before answering, knowing that this call would mark the final chapter in her relationship with the man who had turned her world upside down. Simone. Travis's voice was warm but businesslike. I wanted to personally thank you for introducing us to Terrence Dri. The partnership has been everything we hoped for and more. I think I speak for all of us when I say D-Tech Solutions is going to change the industry. We wouldn't be where we are without you. Simone paused, taking a deep breath. She had expected the call, but hearing it made the reality sink deeper. No, Travis, she replied, her voice calm but tinged with something else. Acknowledgement. You didn't just benefit from the deal. You benefited from something far more valuable than a contract. Terrence gave you more than business, he gave you a lesson. There was a brief silence on the line. Travis didn't speak at first, and when he did, his tone was more reflective than before. You're right, he said quietly. We were all blindsided by his strength, his quiet power. We assumed he was just another CEO, but he wasn't. He is something else. Simone nodded, even though he couldn't see her. She felt the weight of the moment settling into her bones. She had been a part of something much bigger than herself, something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. She had learned that true strength wasn't measured by how loudly you could speak, how often you could command a room, or how much wealth you accumulated. True strength came from within, from the humility to know your worth, and the grace to walk away when others didn't recognize it. Simone ended the call and sat back in her chair. She looked out the window at the city below. It was the same city she had fought for, struggled in, and grown with. But now something felt different. She wasn't the same person who had walked into Holston and Royce all those years ago. She had changed. The story of Terrence Dri wasn't just about a man walking away from a deal. It was about a reminder that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned by how you treated others, by the quiet dignity with which you carried yourself, even in the face of arrogance. It was about the strength to stand firm in your own value, even when the world around you didn't see it. Simone had learned that lesson the hard way, but in the end, it had been worth it. The fall of Holston and Royce wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new understanding, a new respect for what truly mattered. And in that moment, Simone realized that this was the lesson Terrence Dri had come to teach her. The next day, as the office buzzed with the usual urgency, Simone quietly walked past the receptionist's desk, her footsteps echoing down the hall. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to explain. She had already learned what mattered most. And as she walked toward her office, she knew that whatever came next, it wouldn't be about chasing titles or power. It would be about building something that truly lasted. Respect, integrity, and character. As Simone sat down at her desk, she looked at the city skyline one more time. The lesson had been learned, but the journey was far from over. And for the first time in a long time, Simone felt ready for whatever came next, with the strength to move forward with grace and dignity. It was a quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. And that was enough.